Welcome to episode 44 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 28th of January 2025, and this episode is the first episode of this year. My guest today is Rusha Latif, author of Tahrir's Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution, published by the American University and Cairo Press in 2022. Rusha is an Egyptian-American researcher based in the San Fransisco Bay Area, and in this episode we'll be discussing her book, which tells the story of the organized youth behind the mass uprising that brought about the spectacular collapse of the Mubarak regime in Egypt in what came to be known the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Who were these activists? What did they want? How did the movement they unleashed shape them as it unfolded? And why did it ultimately fall short of its goals? Rusha follows the trajectory of the movement from the perspective of the Revolutionary Youth Council, the RYC, a key front forged in Tahrir Square during the early days of the revolt. Drawing on first-hand testimonies and her own direct experience, she offers insight into the motives, hopes, strategies, successes, failures, and disillusionments of the movement's leaders. Her account details the challenges these activists faced as they attempted to steer the movement they had set in motion, and highlights the factors leading to their struggle's defeat despite its initial promise. This episode is supported by the Arab Political Science Network. Welcome to Tahrir Podcast, Rusha. It's a pleasure to finally have you on.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I know it's been a long time coming. We've been talking about doing this episode for several years now since my book came out, and I really appreciate persistence. And I've really enjoyed watching this podcast grow over the years, even though I hadn't been able to make it on as early as I hoped. But I think actually this worked out well. I think this is actually the best time for us to actually have this conversation, much better than earlier when my book came out, just because of everything that's happening in the world and how that's related to the topic of my book.
Indeed. I guess you're pretty battle-hardened at this point.
I've had a lot of, great opportunities to mostly present the book in different lectures. And now I'm, hoping to have more conversations like this one on podcasts and just think out loud with wonderful interlocutors like yourself about my book, its findings, and its relevance in this moment of rupture we're in the world right now with, this new wave of protest movements that are happening globally. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Likewise. All right, let's jump right into it. So in the book, you provide a compelling ethnographic account of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, the RYC, that helped lead Egypt's 2011 uprising. And given that you deeply embedded yourself with these activists, can you share how the idea for this book came about and why you chose to focus on the youth leadership during the revolution, and specifically the RYC, of course?
So I was a graduate student at the time when the revolution erupted in 2011 at the University of California, Davis. At the time, I was actually looking for a research project, and I was exploring social movement theory. I'd come across it through a project that I was considering that looked at the rise of a new crop of young Muslim American leaders who were sort of born in the U.S. and were trying to assert their identity and belonging in the face of a rising right-wing Tea Party movement that was insisting on their exclusion. The specific kind of event that this research revolved around was the Ground Zero Mosque controversy in New York in 2010. It was a cool project. Through it, I discovered this literature on social movement theory, and I became really fascinated with it. Eventually I got bored with that topic just because it felt a little bit too close to me as a Muslim American myself. I felt also like I was studying my friends. I knew a lot of these leaders pretty well. And so I was actually exploring and trying to find something different, maybe something a little bit less depressing. And I couldn't really believe my luck when the revolution erupted in Egypt, given my ties to the country. I was obviously just incredibly moved and inspired. My parents are from there. I had spent some time there before grad school, living and working there. And I actually even took classes in the downtown near Tahrir. So I immediately decided I wanted to study this for my research. And what really inspired me, or I guess Like, I wanted to understand how it happened, right? And so what caught my attention at the time was this, this media narrative about it being a spontaneous, leaderless uprising that was powered by social media, right? That was kind of the messaging we kept getting through news outlets. But at the same time, there was a lot of emphasis on it being youth-led. And I was really intrigued by this tension. Like, how could it be leaderless and youth-led? What does that even mean, right? And so I actually decided, hey, maybe that's a really good research question. So with that question in mind, that sort of became the starting point of my project. And I went to Egypt in 2011 as soon as I could. This was in about like June of 2011. And I started networking with activists immediately. I was lucky in that Tahrir was still buzzing with protests. So it made the activists pretty accessible. And I just started asking around to try to find people who could help me understand if this was something that just erupted completely spontaneously or if there was planning behind it. And sure enough, I was directed to some activists who told me this really amazing story about a protest march that some of the activists had organized that was basically it was a secret strategy that they executed on January 25th. And it's really what brought out the critical mass of protesters like into Tahrir Square. It was responsible for sort of instigating the uprising. And I couldn't really believe the story. It was amazing. It completely captivated me. And the group behind it was called the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. And so suddenly, it dawned on me that this was probably the right group to study and that they would make for a really interesting case study on leadership in the revolution. So essentially, these activists kind of undermine this whole narrative about it being spontaneous and leaderless, and they confirmed I was right to question it. So I ran with that basically, and I continued to follow them in the field. I didn't go into this project intending to write a book. This was actually supposed to be a master's thesis. But by the time I was done with it, it was more like a dissertation. And I thought, well, I better publish this because this is actually really an important story, I think, to come out of the revolution. And I don't want it to be lost to history. And I wanted to preserve it for, a new generation of Egyptians like yourself, who I think one day would want to know these stories and actually hopefully build on it, when they take the baton.
As an Egyptian American with personal ties to the country, you described a profound fieldwork experience in Tahrir Square. So what methodological challenges did you face during your fieldwork, and how did you navigate them?
Yeah, I would say that I faced a lot of challenges actually during the research phase of this project when I was conducting my fieldwork in Cairo. So my challenges, I would say, stemmed from two factors. One had to do with my complex positionality in the field. And then the second one had to do with just the sheer volatility of the revolutionary environment and trying to carry out my research in that environment. So with respect to the former, I had naively imagined before setting out for Cairo that my Egyptian background would make it really easy for me to conduct this research because of this insider status it gave me, right? But it turned out I wasn't as Egyptian as I had thought. Almost as soon as I entered into the field, I became acutely aware of how my middle class upbringing as this Egyptian American, Muslim American in the suburbs of California, combined with my combined with my Nile Delta origins, sort of made me this anomaly and outsider in this setting, and very different from the Egyptian revolutionaries in Cairo I had to engage with for my study. And so this unique intersectionality, or this intersection, what you call intersectional positionality, meant that I had to negotiate a lot of really unexpected dynamics in the field related to my, class, gender, religion, and their various intersections. Not to mention language barriers, cultural barriers, subcultural barriers, in order to build rapport with the activists and be able to interview them, secure interviews with them. So, before going into Egypt, I didn't, I had some knowledge of Egyptian history, but it wasn't as robust as people who had grew up there. And so immediately when I was engaging with them, I had this sense of like, there's this own kind of gap in my own consciousness and my own makeup as an Egyptian that was a little bit hard for me to bridge and trying to relate to these people who were animated by this history in this moment, right? The deep political history, economic history that they were actually living through. And that was helping them or, driving them in their rebellion. So initially I had planned to just stay for like 3 months, but I ended up extending my stay twice because it was just very hard for me to kind of overcome some of these obstacles and get those interviews. And of course, what also added to that was just the volatility of the political environment. Like it was really hard carrying out a study on Egypt's revolutionaries in live time as they were trying to carry out the revolution. Events moved really quickly and unpredictably, which made it hard, I would say, to secure interviews with the activists because, every time there was a flare up, they were getting whisked away to the front lines. And so I would schedule appointments and they wouldn't show up, things like that, right? So it didn't also help that I was the only one pursuing them. And this, again, has to do with the revolutionary environment. So, for instance, there was a lot of researchers and journalists that had descended upon Cairo during that period. And so in a sense, I was competing with them for the attention of the activists. And it's interesting because there was this article at the time, I don't know if you read it, by Professor, she's now deceased, Professor Mona Abaza, may God have mercy on her soul, but she wrote this article about academic tourism in Cairo, and about how a lot of these foreign researchers were coming and they were benefiting career-wise from the research they were doing, but the region itself wasn't seeing, or the country was seeing a return on that investment. And I just remember reading that article in that moment where I felt really unsure about my own position as an American Egyptian, who didn't grow up in Egypt. And was I one of those people or was I actually an Egyptian? So these were things that I had to constantly deal with, the intersection of these two things of the political environment and my own position. I ended up having to get creative with my I ended up having to get creative with my research methods. So because it was really hard in the beginning to conduct interviews or to secure interviews, I was like, okay, maybe I need to actually try to dive into this movement more and do something a little bit different and try to do participant observation as part of my research methods. I didn't initially have that as part of my plan because I wanted to only focus on the first 18 days of the uprising. But I was like, okay, well, maybe if I just try to understand what's happening now or get a feel for it, that could help me interpret the early 18 days. And that's actually what ended up happening. So it actually worked out really well. I got to, and of course, eventually I was able to get the interviews. I mean, I was able to build rapport by just being with the activists all the time. So it all kind of worked out in the end. And I came into my Egyptianness more. I felt more confident, doing the interviews and really just not feeling as alien to that environment, really kind of feeling in some sense a part of the movement. So eventually I ended up, part of what I had to do was adopt different guerrilla research methods for getting the data I needed to conduct my study. One of the things that I did was incorporate participant observation in my research. This wasn't part of my original plan just because I wasn't focusing on the period as it was unfolding. My initial focus period was supposed to be on the early 18 days of the uprising. But since it was really hard to get interviews, I thought, okay, well, maybe if I put myself at the center of the movement, I'll kind of gain some insight into what's happening. I can gain some insight into what happened in the early 18 days. And sure enough, as I started to eventually, I started to get my interviews as I was in the movement and building rapport with the activists. And through the interviews and my observation of current events, I was actually able to get insight into those early 18 days and to see parallels between what the activists were narrating to me, in our interviews about the challenges they faced during that time, and actually see that unfold in real time as well as I was collecting the interviews. So there was this parallel between the moment and what I was learning about the early 18 days through the interviews and the challenges the activists faced. So it was actually really beneficial. So it almost felt like even though I wasn't there early on, in some ways I did get to observe that period through the lens of current events. So that just gives you a sense of like the environment and how I tried to conduct my research in it. The first chapter of my book, chapter 1, which is called Encountering Revolution, Expectations and Reality, is one of my favorite chapters in the book, just because I think it offers this, uniquely rich firsthand account of the intensity and the tumultuousness of that early, revolutionary period. And I also think it offers a good model for researchers for how to, conduct the research in this kind of difficult environment and really practice this idea of intersectional reflexivity.
Sorry, what does intersectional reflexivity mean?
So it just means reflecting on your position and in your research setting and how that shapes the way you collect data and interpret your data, right? What is sort of the story and the narrative and the identities you bring and the lenses you bring based on your class background, your religious background, your gender position, right? And the intersections of them, and how does that interpret the way you engage with the field?
And so to give context for your study, you provide a robust account of Egypt's recent past, tracing the roots of popular discontent through 6 decades, beginning with the ascendancy of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s. Can you explain how Egypt's political history, particularly under Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, set the stage for the youth-led revolution of 2011?
Yes. So the political history that gave rise to the revolution is actually quite complicated. And I think the best way to make sense of it is through the lens of the social contract that underpinned the founding of the modern Republic of Egypt in the 1950s. So the 2011 revolution was the culmination of decades of frustration with this broken social contract that had been central to Egypt's governance since that period. This was an unspoken contract, mind you, and it was established under Nasser after Egypt overthrew its monarchy and freed itself from British domination. And it promised Egyptians national dignity and sovereignty, economic security, and social welfare in exchange for their political obedience. And it was basically rooted in ideals of like self-determination and equality. It was touted as, offering a path to collective prosperity, a sense of pride in Egypt as a leader of the Arab world. However, like over the next 6 decades, this contract eroded essentially, especially under Sadat and Mubarak, until it became completely untenable, particularly for the country's youth who inherited its burdens without ever consenting to its terms, right? This was something their parents' generations had accepted, but not them. So just to give you this brief overview of how it eroded. Under Nasser, this social contract offered Egyptians, free education, free healthcare, state jobs, subsidized goods, all while asserting Egypt's sovereignty through actions like nationalizing the Suez Canal and other major state development projects like the Aswan Dam. So economically speaking, Nasser's state socialism elevated millions of Egyptians into the middle class. But of course, this came at a cost politically. So his regime demanded loyalty in exchange for these benefits. And so this was really the beginning of military authoritarianism in Egypt. And then on the global stage, through this alignment he made with the Soviet Union, Nasser positioned Egypt as a leader of Arab nationalism and a defender of Palestine. So he was really celebrated by his people and even folks in the region for putting Egypt at the forefront of resistance to Western imperialism. But then we started to see like cracks show during his rule as his very ambitious development projects started to like falter. and military spending started to increase as tensions mounted with Israel and its backers, right? And so the big blow came in 1967 with Egypt's defeat in the 1967 war with Israel, right? This dealt a really heavy blow to Egyptians' sense of sovereignty and pride, and it marked a major violation in the terms of the contract. Then Sadat came, and his presidency was, it marked a critical turning point in the breakdown of this contract. Things shifted dramatically under his presidency, right? So economically speaking, he shifted Egypt away from Nasser's state socialism towards economic neoliberalization through the policy known as infitah, which basically opened the country, the country's economy up to foreign investment. And it was hoped for that this, this would bring economic recovery to Egypt, the recovery it desperately needed in this moment. But it primarily benefited a small crony elite, dismantling Nasser-era protections, eroding the welfare state, and in the process, exacerbating inequality. So this led to widespread discontent, and the major symbol of that was the 1977 bread riots, which was sparked by IMF-mandated subsidy cuts. Politically speaking, Sadat introduced a very limited political opening, which, along with the infitah, was part of this larger strategy he had to establish an alignment with the so-called democratic West, right, and to secure its patronage. So he introduced some liberal reforms, but those were all overshadowed by his reliance on authoritarian tools to suppress dissent, specifically emergency law, right? And then geopolitically, we know his biggest move was the 1979 Camp David Accords, which aligned Egypt with the U.S. in exchange for aid and the return of Sinai. So this treaty was met with widespread anger from Egyptians. They saw, the peace agreement with Israel as a complete betrayal of Palestine and Arab unity. So this alignment really with Western powers, though it was lucrative for the regime, it just increasingly and further alienated ordinary Egyptians who saw that their country's sovereignty, and dignity was, becoming increasingly compromised. And then, Mubarak comes along and he essentially follows in the footsteps of Sadat, and he accelerates the collapse of the social contract. So economically speaking, he deepened these neoliberal reforms, extensively privatizing state assets and scaling back subsidies. And of course, these reforms, I would say, mostly enriched his inner circle while leaving nearly half of the population in poverty. Unemployment soared during this period, especially among youth, and living costs became unbearable. And Cairo itself as a city became the symbol of inequality, right? With lavish gated communities for the elite that were surrounded by these very rundown, sprawling slums. Politically, then, what did Mubarak do? He maintained and expanded Sadat's repressive apparatus, and through doing so, he basically fully consolidates Egypt as a police state. So this is when we see the police state really take. So this is when we see the police state start to come out in full force. And he maintains the emergency law, which enables his regime to carry out mass surveillance, arbitrary arrests, torture. There were elections during that period, but they were mostly seen as a farce and rigged. Corruption was rampant also, as well during this period amongst the political elite. And then the things that happen on the global stage. So Mubarak basically seals his alignment with the U.S. and their foreign policy, which fuels widespread anger again amongst Egyptians. And so some of his actions included maintaining the peace with Israel, facilitating the war on Iraq, or facilitating the Iraq War, and tolerating Israeli actions during the Second Intifada. So Egyptians basically, I would say, saw their government as a tool for U.S. empire. In their eyes, the state's subservience to American interests and complicity in the suffering of Palestinians in particular was seen as, a major betrayal of the social contract. So, of course, throughout this turbulent history, none of these regime actions went unchallenged. And so we saw, many protests throughout these 6 decades, especially during the last decade under Mubarak, in the run-up to the uprising in 2011. But what I really want to emphasize right now is that, by 2011, this social contract that I've been talking about has fully collapsed. And that's the main point of this whole discussion, right? And I really can't stress this enough. Like, for Egypt's young people, this wasn't just a rejection of Mubarak. It was really a rejection of this arrangement that they had inherited, but never agreed to, right? The arrangement under this contract. And they were the primary victims of this broken system. They were unemployed. They were burdened by rising costs. Some of them, a lot of them couldn't get married because they couldn't afford to. They were suffocated by political repression. And a lot of these grievances came to a head in 2010 with the police killing of Khalid Said, who was this young man in Alexandria. And it really, Khalid became the symbol of this generational anger. So his, this brutal murder really, I think, underscored the regime's indifference to its citizens. And it resonated very deeply with all these young people who saw themselves in his story and really identified with him. So there were online platforms that emerged from this incident. The We Are All Khalid Said Facebook page was the main one. And that, sort of galvanized their frustrations and helped facilitate the January 25th protests. So basically, the youth-led revolution was about more than, jobs or elections or just removing a dictator. It was really this demand for dignity, justice, and a future. These young people wanted a future. And it was a sort of a rejection of decades of economic inequality, political repression, and foreign subordination. So they were seeking to rebuild a system that reflected their aspirations for sovereignty, for fairness, and for freedom.
So the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 is often portrayed as a spontaneous, social media-driven event. And in contrast, your book emphasizes that it was the result of years of political organization, politically organizing, and so forth. And I have something to share when it comes to that. I think the argument that the revolution was a climax rather than something spontaneous is something I believe in. I think it is the closest thing really to reality in explaining what happened in 2011 in Egypt. And this is, of course, partly due to the American policy in the region at this particular point of time, and the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the protests that were allowed in Egypt against the invasion of Iraq, and the movements that came out of it and grew out of it throughout this decade that preceded the revolution. And when people started meeting, they started making connections. There was networks being formed, and most importantly, there was experience. And the people would things would be tried, tactics would be tried, and then they would test things out and see what works and what doesn't. And so, in this context and this light, the Egyptian Revolution could be kind of explained as the climax or culmination of this whole of this buildup. And what I think your book really does to that argument is that it humanizes it, and shows its human element. So it's not just explained. So it's not just that this argument is explained in terms of just, quote, people forming, quote, networks, building, quote, experiences, and so forth. It actually gives it a face, really. So how did your research challenge these simplified narratives? And by simplified narratives, I mean the idea that it was something spontaneous and social media driven. And what did you discover about the grassroots organizing behind the uprising?
Sure. Thank you for that. So I agree completely with your assessment. I really appreciate the shout out for the kind of human element. For me, I really wanted to know the human story behind the revolution, and that's why I did this, research. I mean, it was it was my personal motivation. I wanted to meet the young people who were supposedly beside this and hear their stories and understand, like, how did it happen? Like, what actually drove you to do this in this moment, to be a part of this movement? And so the book is actually, it's structured around the narratives of 10 activists. That's probably important to say early on, just so that to give a sense of, like, how this human element comes out. These were, young people that I profile, and I sort of trace the eruption of the revolution through their life stories. So, the deeper history of the story and, this history that I just talked to you about, like, how are they embedded in that history? How did that shape their politicization and activation and kind of bring them to this moment where they were at the forefront of the uprising? So these were, as I mentioned, and we'll probably talk about this more, but leaders of this group called the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, and they were of very diverse backgrounds. So they brought a whole range of stories that are very different, from different class backgrounds, from different familial backgrounds. Some of them were from political families, some of them weren't. There's gender diversity, and we can talk about that more later. But through those different lenses, I try to kind of extract their stories. And also the neighborhoods and where they grew up, and what were the things that were happening there that kind of awakened their political consciousness, right? So that's a section that I sort of talk about. But really, I think what I'm trying to do with the book is show that, the problem with this whole spontaneity trope, right, is that it makes it seem like the revolution erupted in a vacuum. And especially when you combine it with the social media narrative, it makes it seem like, that especially when you combine it with the social media narrative, it makes it seem as though, the agency behind this revolution was, like, in the hands of these, like, tech bros in the Silicon Valley, right? It kind of erases the activists. And I'm from the Silicon Valley, so I can say, right, I can be critical of that. But, and so I honestly went into this impression, not really into this, like, research, not expecting all these research, like, these really, like, rich stories to come out. And so what I discovered actually was that you're right. January 25th was actually the culmination of a decade of, resistance and resistance movements that had been growing in the streets of Cairo and across Egypt and as I mentioned, the years before the revolt. And these protests, this resistance movement, unfolded in 4 different waves. So the first had to do with, if you actually ask any of these Egyptian activists, like, when did the revolution actually start? They wouldn't say January 25th. Hands down, they would all say it started in the year 2000 with the second Intifada, right? That was the event that kind of politicized many of them for the first time, inspired them to protest for the first time and to organize. They were participating in protests in the street. They were organizing mass actions on the university campuses, kind of like the youth are today across the U.S. and different parts of the world. And so this was like a key moment in their, politicization and activation. And then what followed that was the Iraq War protests. So that kind of wave embraced that moment as well. And so together, this was like the first wave around, like, regional struggles. Then there was a second wave around, sort of a pro-democracy movement with Kifaya. Then there was a third wave around growing discontent amongst workers and solidarity with them in their struggle. And then there was a fourth one around police brutality, and that again was with the murder of Khalid Said. So in those first two waves, these youth were becoming politicized and activated and socialized into activism for the first time, right? And then in the second two waves, we see them actually, they're the ones who now are establishing and leading the movements with like April 6th youth movement, which was in solidarity with like the workers, right? And then We Are All Khalid Said, the Facebook page. So as they're establishing these new movements, they're also introducing new tactics and strategies. And one of them was flash protests in popular neighborhoods. So the idea behind this strategy or this tactic was to start drawing in the masses into the resistance, right? And this was actually something the old guard, which had led those first two waves, the old guard of the movement, sort of the older activists, had failed to do. And activists were really, they were kind of critical of the approach of that generation. They felt like their approach to kind of protest and activism was a little bit elitist. So one of the things they used to do was host their protests in front of like downtown government buildings, which like people weren't going to come out to from the outskirts of Cairo, right? So what they tried to do was the opposite. They tried to take the protests to them in the popular areas. So these were some of the tactics that you're talking about that they were experimenting with. And so as they were doing that, they were now starting to kind of raise the culture of resistance in Egypt to new heights. And at the same time, they were building this very robust, decentralized, loose, network of activists, of folks engaged in this resistance movement that was making space for people to easily join the movement, to act autonomously and creatively, and step up as leaders, which is what they were themselves doing, right? So this is really important to understand this kind of, format of the movement, because that becomes the now hallmark feature of this movement, right? So when January 25th came along, I mean, that was Police Day in Egypt. The activists had been protesting on that day wasn't new. This was something they had done in the previous years since Mubarak instituted that as a holiday to sort of celebrate the service of police in the year 2009. And that activists, of course, appropriated that holiday to protest the police state. And so they were, planning their protests as usual, not really intending to do anything different until Tunisia happened, right? This is when the activists, when Tunisians successfully toppled their dictator, Ben Ali, in December of 2010. So suddenly now this moment took on a new air of possibility. Like this protest they had planned or were planning could be much bigger than what they had originally intended. And so they started to strategize around that with that in mind. And they drew on these tactics that they had already been testing in the years before. Especially this protest one. So in this secret strategy that I mentioned at the outset of this conversation, this is the story at the core of my book. The key tactic of that strategy was this idea of flash protests in popular neighborhoods. They decided that they would, basically the strategy was, and it was a secret because they wanted to keep it away from police. They announced 20 protest locations online. And the idea was to, tell, on Facebook pages like We Are All Khalid Said, the idea was to get people to go to those protest locations and use them to decoy the police. And then they came up with the 21st secret location in one of these popular neighborhoods. And the plan was to kind of build up a mass of protesters and create this snowball march that would hopefully funnel down the streets of Cairo, pick up more people, and just become this unstoppable force. And originally, they didn't even plan to go as far as Tahrir Square. I mean, they went to Mustafa Mahmoud. That was the plan. Mustafa Mahmoud Square, which is outside of Cairo, but it was one of the 20, they went to Mustafa Mahmoud Square, which was one of the 20 protest locations that they had originally announced. But by the time they got there, they just couldn't believe their numbers. I mean, they had completely tapped into, the turnouts far surpassed their expectations. So eventually, the importance is So the importance of this march is that it brought in the critical mass into Tahrir Square that facilitated this game-changing siege of the square. And so, when we think about this idea of this being a spontaneous revolution, I mean, this whole story completely defies that narrative, right? Clearly, there was some planning behind it, and it's important to identify it's important to understand the kind of, how do I want to say it? So they bring in the critical mass. So this protest march is that's why it's really important. But what's really interesting now is what happens after this moment, because, the activists were kind of expecting that they could, bring out a lot of people that day. They didn't expect it to be that many. And what started to happen was that the masses now started to, in some ways, act spontaneously. And so this is where you see that interplay now happen between planning and spontaneity. The masses themselves started to chant, and this wasn't part of the original chants that the activists had come up with for that day. Their chants revolved around, helping people, trying to tap into socioeconomic frustrations. So stuff related to rising food costs and problems with the education system, right? They were trying to, use chants that would make people feel more comfortable joining the protest. So there was nothing against Mubarak or nothing against any specific political figures, right? It was just mostly about socioeconomic issues. But the people themselves started to chant the chant from Tunisia, which was, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, we want the end of the regime. So now it started to turn into a revolutionary situation. And this is where now the story of these activists becomes very fascinating, because this wasn't something they were prepared for, but now they have to figure out how to run with it. And so that's another story that I try to follow in the book, is what happened when, unprepared for this situation, they tried to make the most of it. What do we learn from that experience?
One of the key focuses, obviously, of your book is the Revolutionary Youth Council, the RYC, which brought together activists from different political and ideological backgrounds. So could you tell us more about the RYC? What prompted their formation? And what did their leadership look like during the 18-day uprising?
So the RYC, the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, was made up of the most active youth movements and youth factions of political parties on the ground before January 25th. They included groups like the April 6th Youth Movement, a group called the Youth for Justice and Freedom Movement, the campaign supporting Mohammed al-Baradei, and a number of others, also youth from the Muslim Brotherhood. This group was a really interesting group because they reflected the diversity of Egypt's revolutionaries in terms of their gender, class, religious, and ideological background, as well as their age. And as I mentioned, demonstrated, they were the organizers of this game-changing January 25th mass action. They were actually building on this history of organizing that they had started in that decade before the uprising, and it was a very long history. So the coalition, when they launched that secret strategy and together brought out this critical mass of protesters into Tahrir on January 25th, they were still a loose network of these different youth movements. It wasn't until 10 days into the uprising that they consolidated themselves as a revolutionary youth coalition. And there was, their formation itself grew out of a question that they were confronted with in this moment, right? So you have to remember that up until this point, these were activists, right? They weren't revolutionaries. With the success of the uprising on January 25th, something unexpected was happening to them, which was their status was shifting from activists to revolutionaries, and they were trying to wrap their heads around what this meant. So, a lot of them had imagined, or dreamt of revolution, but none of them ever really thought it was possible, just because Mubarak had completely, decimated any hope of that. He really had completely quashed political life in the years before. So none of them really saw that kind of opening. And so they didn't plan and strategize for it. They weren't thinking in terms of revolutionary strategizing. So then all of that changed when this political opening came. And now they had to figure out like what role they should play, if any, as leaders in this nascent revolutionary struggle. They felt this responsibility historically because they had in some ways instigated this uprising, right? So they couldn't drop the ball. They had to like run with it, even if they weren't completely ready. So now this question is like, how do we lead, if at all, and how? So the consolidation grew out of that question, but there were specific circumstances and things that happened that sort of made them waver and go back and forth before they actually kind of came out in this as this sort of unified front with a name, right, that they stood behind. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. It's related to this question of the actual structure and nature of the movement that I flagged for you earlier, which was kind of the hallmark of the pre-revolutionary period, which was this loose, decentralized movement configuration. While it enabled the protesters early on, while it enabled the activists early on to be able to like mobilize the masses and quickly scale like their protest movement and turn Egypt and create a revolutionary situation. It actually in this moment started to undermine them from being able to take advantage of that opportunity they created for themselves. And so you might have heard this in previous like conversations is like, this structure was like an advantage early on, but it became a liability. But I think what's really interesting is actually observing that a little bit more closely through the lens of this group, the Youth Coalition, who actually tried to engage with it, because we start to see some very interesting like pain points that surfaced that I think are actually really instructive for our movements.
Yeah, and I'm really curious about how this horizontal movement structure impacted the leadership of the activists and the outcome of the movement. So could you maybe elaborate on that more?
Yeah, so I think the best way to understand how this horizontal, decentralized movement structure played out during this moment is to look at it through the lens of the experience of the RYC. So up until the activists announced themselves as the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, which, as I mentioned, was about 10 days into the uprising, these activists were reluctant and hesitant to step to the forefront in any way as leaders. Instead, they were mostly leading from behind the scenes and engaging what I like to call performing leaderlessness. And there was several reasons for this. The most important one had to do with the this horizontal, decentralized nature of their movement, which carried over from the previous period. Remember that I said that this was the hallmark of the pre-January 25th protest decade. So what's interesting in this moment is that while the activists' status changed from activists to revolutionaries, what didn't change, what remained constant, was this movement structure. And so just as this horizontalism had for years empowered them to take initiative and act autonomously and creatively by coming up with new, protest tactics and strategies for advancing the cause of the movement, it was now starting to empower the thousands of Egyptians who had joined the movement to do the same. And so as it was doing that, it started to limit and constrain the way that the activists could show up as leaders in this moment. So the more this movement grew, the less they felt comfortable and like it was their place to be able to say hey, we're the leaders of the movement, because this was now widely seen as this mass people's movement. And in fact, if they tried to claim leadership, they would have faced serious backlash from the movement itself, because the movement really, really fetishized its popular leaderless nature. And it had a tendency to do this. If anybody stepped out in any way as a leader or some kind of a symbol or icon of the movement, it tore them down. It was pretty vicious. And, the reason behind this is because, this movement's leaderlessness is what made it seem legitimate in the eyes of its participants. So that's why... so that was the image that both the activists and the protesters themselves kept promoting. And on top of just, the movement structure, if they were to announce themselves as, leaders, this would have been a problem, right? It would have made them regime targets. So there was a danger and a risk in that. And then claiming any kind of leadership was like a really big move that nobody was really prepared to make. Like, what does it mean to lead a revolution? What's the responsibility? Like what's the responsibility that I'm committing to shouldering, right? So these are all these. So this was the ambiguity that they were wrestling with. So this was the position of the activists until after an event that you might remember, Abdullah, called the Battle of the Camel. And this was a violent episode in which the regime sent thugs to attack protesters in the square. And so right after that incident, there was like a group of opposition figures who formed themselves into a little association they called the Council of Wise Men, which was really triggering for like the women and young people in the square. But they basically started to enter into negotiations with the government and officials about how to bring an end to this impasse. And that's the moment when the activists realized that there had to be leadership in this movement. There had to be some kind of official group that represented the radical position of the square, or else all of these forces were going to like undermine them and sell them out and demobilize their movement. So on February 6th, that's when they decided to announce themselves as the RYC in response to this event. And the first thing that they proclaimed, this was like a very well-known proclamation, was there's no negotiations before the departure. لا تفاوض قبل الرحيل, right? That came from this group. So they committed to occupying the square until, all of the demands of the protesters were met. And so at this moment, the RYC becomes the closest thing to a vanguard in the square. But then it's interesting because now there's these new dynamics that come into play that make it difficult for them to lead. And they never wanted to be the leaders of the whole movement too. Like they kept saying, we're not the leaders of the revolution. We just represent our groups, which maybe they told me made up to possibly like 10% of the people in the square, right? But they were still seen as having a lot of legitimacy because, one, they were the first front to kind of emerge. And two, they represented the youthful energy behind the movement. And so that's what people were really identifying with in this moment. But then there was this issue like, okay, after their formation, it became clear to not just them, but members of other groups that this wasn't sufficient, like as an organizational front. They had to find a way to like institute, to come up with like a larger front that reflected a wider consensus among all of the different political movements and groups in the square about like how they should proceed in this moment. And so there was talk about establishing a more representative body. And this was really urgent in this moment because they were trying to escalate and get Mubarak to step down. And there wasn't any kind of like, a revolutionary body that could claim power on behalf of the revolution. So the RYC just becomes this really interesting study because they were like a focal point right now. And so you see some of these dynamics between the wider movement and the coalition come into play. So one of the things that we saw was that there was this intergenerational, like these tensions that surfaced because a lot of the old guard felt really upstaged by the young people in this moment because they were getting the limelight. And so, there was like this friction that resulted from that really hindered their efforts collectively to produce leadership in revolutionary organizations. Another challenge the revolutionaries faced had to do with like this commitment they had to bottom-up consensus building processes, which is known as participatory democratic practice. This is like an official like social movement theory term, right? As their method for collective decision-making. So the problem with this horizontal democratic practice, while, a good thing in theory, in this moment, it proved to be extremely time-consuming. And it didn't match the urgency of the revolutionary moment. Like the activists really needed to act quickly and think about how they wanted to move forward, especially as the elite were making moves to try to contain a movement. But this process like really slowed them down as they were trying to figure out like, Are we going to establish a larger representative body? Who's going to be in that group? Like all of these discussions that were happening in the revolutionary circles were just taking a lot of time, right? And so the culmination of all of this is that the revolutionaries were outmaneuvered by the SCAF, who, the SCAF is the Security Council of Armed Forces. This was the military body that eventually prompted, Mubarak to resign. And they took power essentially before the revolutionaries could coordinate and seize it themselves, in the form of a popularly backed civilian transitional government or some other revolutionary body. And so what happens is that these dynamics start to carry over into what we call the transitional period, which was after Mubarak's ouster, and that goes all the way until the first democratic election, which is when Mohamed Morsi was elected president. So in this period, with Mubarak removed, the revolutionaries now lose that common cause that unified all of them. And they have to now deal with the SCAF being in power and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the largest oppositional force in Egypt at the time, and the most organized. They were part of the initial revolutionary camp that ousted Mubarak, but now they start to split in this moment and throw them under the bus. And so the problem is with these two forces, the revolutionaries are now just out-organized. And so the thing is that they were just put in this moment where they had to figure out how to build the plane as they were flying it, as I like to say, right? Like the cart left before the horse. A revolution started before they were ready. And so because of that, they could really never get ahead of their opponents and really structure this movement in a way that was going to allow them to achieve a revolutionary outcome in the movement. So ultimately, all these factors, and there's more to discuss about how this decentralized movement structure, this horizontalism, played out in the horizontal period. But the point of all of this is that the activists were kind of up against this structure that just wasn't conducive, didn't help them in their moment, and there wasn't any time or space to kind of step back and think through how they can overcome the obstacles it put before them, if that makes sense.
And your book also examines how gender, class, religion, and their multiple intersections shape the revolutionary youth's experiences. So can you elaborate on how these factors influenced their activism and leadership, and how they navigated both internal and external expectations around these identities? And feel free to talk about just one specific example, if possible.
Yeah. So, because that's a lot, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to a discussion of all three of those and more. But I'll start with the most obvious one, which was the impression Western media gave us early on, based on the kind of Twitterati, as I like to call them, or this is as they're commonly called, youth voices. So actually, I don't want to say as I like to call them because I didn't make up that term. Let me fix that. How did I start that? That was a really good opening. Hold on. Yeah, okay. I'll start with the most obvious one. So I'll start with the most obvious one because I actually wrote, a whole chapter that discusses all of these different variables and how they played out in the trajectory of the activists in this historical moment. The most obvious one has to do with class, right? So the impression Western media gave us early on, based on the Twitter users and youth voices that they were centering in their coverage of the movement, was that the activists who were behind the revolt were these highly cosmopolitan, English-speaking, tech-savvy young people who came from, financially comfortable backgrounds and went to elite universities like the AUC in the American University in Cairo. And so one of the things my research revealed was that this was largely inaccurate. And in fact, most of the organizers in the RYC, especially those who were really key in instigating the January 25th uprising through the secret strategy that I mentioned to you, they didn't fit this profile at all. Many of them identified as members of the popular class, right? And this is really important, and it actually really makes sense because it means that the activists who were behind this revolution, these leading figures came from the very neighborhoods and the very marginalized classes and communities that they were trying to mobilize, right? So this class background or this class capital actually gave them the knowledge they needed to take on this undertaking, right? They understood the deep grievances that people had in these neighborhoods, the socioeconomic grievances. They understood the fear that they had of police, right? And so part of their strategizing was accounting for all of these factors, and that's why it was so successful. And just, briefly in terms of of gender, the revolution was celebrated for the equal participation of men and women. And that's accurate. Like, women were doing everything that men were doing. They were leading protests. They were engaging in violent encounters with the police. But what I found was that when it came to leadership, actual leadership was gendered. So, for instance, out of the 13 leaders in the Revolutionary Youth Coalition's executive committee, this was kind of the leadership body of the RYC, only one of them was a woman. And she also happened to be the only Coptic. So she kind of checked off 2 boxes, right? So that's something to keep in mind, and I discuss that extensively in the book. And then as for the religious and ideological leanings of the revolutionary youth, I actually assumed that most of them would identify as secular going into this research. But in fact, I quickly realized that secular is a super murky term in the Egyptian context. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what I found was that the RYC activists found really interesting ways of blending their faith. And here I'm talking mostly about Muslim faith, since the majority were Muslim, blending their faith with their liberal and leftist ideologies. And among them, as I mentioned, one of the factions in the RYC was the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were a really particularly fascinating case study. And the way they were sort of coming up with new ideologies that accounted for their appreciation for the Islamic tradition as sort of a resource from drawing, they call it marga Islamiyya. So like for drawing inspiration for how to think about politics, and especially in this revolutionary moment.
Despite the success of toppling Mubarak following his 30-year rule, the revolution didn't lead to the kind of systemic change that many activists had hoped for. So, in your view, what were the key factors that contributed to that?
When we talk about the defeat of the revolution, and I prefer to use the term defeat over failure. I know some people like to say failure. I think it's more accurate to say defeat. One, it's a lot less final. And 2, just because the movement was defeated, it doesn't mean that this defeat was permanent. So even as we talk about the disappointment and things that didn't go in the activists' favor, or outcomes that were contrary to those they hoped for, we have to keep in mind that revolutions are long processes that can take many decades to unfold. And so the term defeat, leaves open this possibility that the movement could somehow resurge, and it could still win, theoretically in the end. So just with that, preface, I would say that the revolution was defeated, at least this phase, due to 2 critical interdependent factors. The first has to do with, this lack of organization and structure and just issues with strategy. And the second has to do with the lack of a positive, actionable vision or project for Egypt's future. So let's talk a little bit about these 2. Starting with the latter, this idea of not having like a clear vision or project. So one of the main reasons why the activists started to lose support is because it became very difficult for the public to identify what it was that they aspired to beyond removing Mubarak, and therefore support them in this venture they were on, right? The activists had clearly articulated what they didn't want, but they never, in a robust, very clear way, said, this is the vision that we have for Egypt. And so essentially they learned the hard way that, revolutions are about competing political projects. And if you don't have one to offer the public, you lose, right? They started to lose support. they had these ideals of like bread, freedom, and social justice, which were all very noble, but they were also very vague and abstract, right? So this really needed to be translated into some sort of an actionable project and concrete vision. And so again, this isn't to say that they didn't have good ideas for the future of Egypt, but none of them like really rose to the top and consolidated it into this clear program, right, for the country and the revolution as a whole. And so this brings me to the second point about, the lack of an organizational structure, issues with strategy. The movement was basically just organizationally and structurally incoherent. And I'll just give you an example of this. It was something that I got to experience firsthand because I was in Egypt at the time. It was one of the upheavals around the Mustafa Mahmoud clashes in November of 2011. This was one of the major upheavals in what people called, Egypt's second revolution, because it was very similar to the 18-day uprising. And so that was one of the moments that I talked about earlier in our conversation where participant observation came in really handy because it was almost like I was seeing this event that sort of mirrored the 18 days. And I got some insight into it, having missed those 18 days myself because I was in California at the time. But the point is, one of the things that I experienced or noticed, and this is something others have mentioned, was this phenomena of what we can call like a leadership archipelago, right? Where the movement felt like a bunch of islands with different leadership groups emerging on them. And these different groups were like unaware of each other's activities and started to act at cross purposes as they were trying to figure out how to capitalize on this new political opening and seize power for the movement. There were different groups talking about establishing different revolutionary bodies that were going to take over like power and announce themselves as the leaders and all of these different things. But it was like there wasn't kind of cohesion behind these conversations, right? So that was something that I noticed. So horizontalism, this horizontalism played out as this double-edged sword again in the movement, right? Where it was an advantage in the beginning because it helped people mobilize very quickly and get the masses onto the streets. But then it became a liability as people were trying to direct the movement and push it towards a revolutionary outcome. So it's good for resisting the status quo, but not trying to like kind of replace it, right? So there's this mismatch between the movement aims and the organizational forms. And so this takes me to this question again of vision and project, right? Because you have to have a clear idea of the goals so that you can figure out how to get there, right? It's this classic, the classic like form follows function argument, right? So part of the challenge is that, they couldn't come up with theories in that moment. One, because they were just so caught up in the current events and trying to resist the advances of the counter-revolution and the attempts of the military and partnership with the Muslim Brotherhood basically trying to shut down and contain the movement, right? So a lot of they kind of fell into reactive mode where they were just resisting and trying to block these moves and advances. But really, if they did have that space, then that was the kind of thinking they would have need to have done, which is like, where do we actually want to go and how do we sort of design and better structure this movement and its leadership to get us there, right? But that's the benefit of this whole experiment altogether, because we now have this very, we can call it like a prototype of a revolution or a proto-event to like think with and extract some of these dilemmas, pain points that the activists struggled with, and maybe use those as starting points for imagining, what we could do with the next political opening.
This leads us to the next question, which I think touches on the part of how another opening could be dealt with differently. And so reflecting on the revolution itself and your research, what do you think are the key lessons for both activists and political movements globally? What worked in the case of Egypt's uprising, and what could have been done differently to avoid some of the post-revolutionary setbacks?
Yeah, I think, I think this is related to the question we just discussed, right? So, if we're just thinking about, well, first, I'd like to be very fair to the revolutionaries, because I know a lot of people like to just really criticize and say, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. And I really try not to take that approach, because I was there and I saw how crazy and hectic it was. And I'm like, how do you do this? Like, this is really hard trying to like carry out a revolution, right? So I think it happened the way it was supposed to, so that we could learn from it. That's the first thing I'll say. Um, I think you could say things like, well, they should have continued doing like grassroots organizing, the organizing necessary to continue to build the support base and strengthen, the revolutionary consciousness in the masses. But again, it wasn't that easy because of like all the constraints they were under and just the pressure of the time, and that they had to figure out how to resist the military from trying to quash the movement. Um, but if we're looking at like larger takeaways and lessons, I mean, I think the first one is, Egypt taught us, and we've seen this now repeatedly, that revolutionary situations are still possible. So you have to actually be ready, right? And that wasn't something they knew before January 25th, right? That's why they weren't strategizing for revolution. But now that we know it's possible, there could be another eruption. The lesson is to actually do the work now, and the sort of, this quiet moment, relatively quiet. Things are never quiet in Egypt and in the region, but, to do the thinking when you're not in this, what Gramsci would call the war of maneuver, where it's like the attack period, right? He would refer to this as kind of the war of position, or like thinking and strategizing. So I think that's really an important, like really just a major lesson. And, the book doesn't offer many more lessons beyond that. I would say what it does more is make us ask important questions that can help us ultimately solve for this problem, right? Which is what I think you're indirectly asking, which is like, how do we actually carry out a revolution in our age, in the region, in our countries, around the world. And I think these questions again are related to these general categories that I mentioned, which is, around how we think about organization and structure, and also project and vision and goals. So some of the questions that I think are important that the revolution raises, and I'll give you one example. I have a lot that I've been thinking about, but in terms of like thinking about project and agenda for the movement. So one of the whole points of revolution is, to capture state power, right? But one of the things that the Egyptians kind of struggled with on the ground is, how do you capture state power when not all of the power over your country is in the hands of the ruling class of your country alone, but also outside of its borders, right? So in the case of Egypt, power wasn't just with the Egyptian ruling class, it was also with the US and like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, right? There's all these other players. So can you even fully have a revolution in a place like Egypt with empire still intact? If not, then what does that say about how we think about like what our goal is? Does the whole, is this now moving into the territory of questioning like the global order, and thinking about how to build an internationalist movement and organize within it to figure out maybe how to dismantle the nation state model? I mean, maybe that's one of the targets of a program, right? I don't know, but these are sort of the questions that I'm saying you have to start dwelling on to think about a way out of this. So really the Egyptian revolutionaries and RYC as kind of my case study helped to sort of surface these tensions that I think are really important. It's very easy for us to say, well, this mode of organizing, horizontalism, didn't work. But my own thoughts on that is like, well, is it that it didn't work, or that we didn't structure it or that we didn't like structure it properly, like in a way that could help us and then sorry, how did I say it? Because so some people like to say, well, horizontalism was the problem, and that's why the movement like didn't work, right? But the question I ask is, well, is it that horizontalism was the problem, or that maybe it wasn't structured properly, right? So these are the kinds of questions that I'm saying we should think about, and not just kind of, just be fully dismissive of the model. I mean, you want to actually get to this sort of pain points, if that makes sense.
It does. And this leads us to the last question. Finally, you mentioned in an interview with Jadaliya that your research will continue in the field of youth activism. So can you share any insights into your upcoming projects, and how will you build on the lessons from the book in your future work?
Yeah, sure. So So I'm in the early stages of like this next project, but basically it's sort of along the lines of, the way I answered the last two questions is that I'm kind of obsessed with this question of like how to, like, we've watched so many different, not just the Egyptian revolutionaries, but so many revolutionaries across the world at different points in the last 10 to 14 years, really have these kind of revolutionary openings. And it seems like there's this moment where things are going to work out in their favor, and then they end up bringing in situations that are a lot worse than the ones they were in previously. So it just begs the question, like, what are we doing wrong? Like, how do we improve these models, right? These are like theoretical questions. So I'm just really starting with the starting points that I'm getting out of my own book and the questions it's raised for me, and trying to grapple with them and try to understand their implications for how we think about the future of revolutionary organizing in the 21st century. It's funny because I think, a lot of academic works focus on, doing the studies and providing, recording what actually happened in these moments and making sure they're available for us to study. But it's not very often that that knowledge is fed back into the movement to improve it, right? And this is sort of a tension that social movement theorists and scholars in particularly struggle with. There's this emphasis in the field about like, we can't be careerists. Like we have an obligation to actually go back and take this knowledge back to the movements. So I produced this book in that spirit. I really think that Egypt's revolutionaries gave us a huge gift with this, with their defeat, actually, in that through it, they revealed the limits of existing theories for revolutionary organizing, and they gave us some ways to start thinking about new ways forward. So I'm really, committed to supporting that cause however I can. I mean, I carried out this book in solidarity with them, so I'm hoping that somehow it could feed into the larger cause and struggle. There's a field of study that I've been putting this book in conversation with. I don't know if you're familiar with the practice of design research, design thinking, design innovation. But these are methodologies that are often used in like, tech spaces and other like different disciplines for thinking about like problem solving and innovation. And I feel like the movement space is really ripe for that. So I've, and one of the main methods that they use to kind of draw insights from the field and like users, right? So like UX research, is, to kind of develop solutions, whether they be in tech or government or something else, is ethnography, right? And so it dawned on me later as I was coming and getting ready to publish this book that what I had essentially produced was like I produced design research like on a revolution, right? There's a lot of insights I think that can be extracted that are actionable for thinking about new ways forward. So I'm looking at my book now through that new lens, and as I mentioned, I'm still in the early stages, but I'm excited about the kinds of things I'm seeing anew in the book through this lens.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing your future projects and to, being part of them, perhaps, as part of the case studies for them.
Yeah, then you'll be like a revolutionary, like, for the next generation. I'll be writing a book by you.
Was definitely. And
that's what the point of this podcast, right? Is to get all our insights from the folks who've written books on the revolution. So
that just pile up all the knowledge and then just use it.
Yeah, awesome. I'm really proud of the work that you've been doing. It's a really amazing, a canon, I think, of knowledge, and that you're just making it accessible to a lot of people so that our books don't just like collect dust on shelves in libraries.
I hope so. I hope not. So before we end it, Rusha, any closing remarks?
I don't really have anything more to add about the book, except that I want to give a nod to the moment that we're in right now with this, rupture we're in with Gaza and the global movement that's been growing in solidarity. with the Palestinians and their struggle for liberation. Just a reminder, that I said at the outset of this conversation that the Egyptian revolution really did start in solidarity with the Palestinians, right? With the solidarity protests in the Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000. And so I'm really hopeful. It's something, and it's part of the reason why I'm talking about the book a lot right now, is that somehow, some way, I'd really hope and pray, and I'd love to see this movement, the story of the revolution, kind of come full circle to this moment that we're in. And somehow its learnings to kind of feed back into this moment and play a role in, liberating Palestine and the whole region along with it, and hopefully the world. So, free Palestine, of course. So I'll end with that. And thank you so much, Abdullah, for this conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Rusha. And to fellow listeners, all links are going to be in the description. And I highly recommend that you read Rusha's book. And thank you so much for listening.
كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 والله وروح حسني مبارك 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 الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام والله وروح حسني مبارك 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 كلنا في نفس واحد كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 كلنا ايد واحدة طلبنا حاجة واحدة مدنية 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 والله وروح حسني مبارك 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 الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام الشعب خلاص أسقط النظام والله وروح حسني مبارك 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 والله افرح يا مصر والله وروح حسني مبارك والله وروح يا جماعة والله وروح حسني مبارك 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 من الأول مش هنزهق كلنا ايد واحدة